Hello, Premier John Horgan here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation. Indigenous Peoples Day is a time to honor the culture and traditions, the history and the achievements of Indigenous peoples here in BC and across Canada. After hundreds of years of ongoing colonialism, violence, and racism, after decades of talk, it's time to step up and show our collective commitment to reconciliation by taking action. Actions grounded in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Actions like unanimously passing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in the BC legislature. It's clear that as a province and a country, we have much work to do. Racism and hate are still too common in this great country. It's part of our past, and we've seen most recently in Kamloops the impact our history can have on present day. As we saw recently in London, Ontario, where violence and hate reared its ugly head. Today and every day, I appreciate the strength and resilience of Indigenous peoples. I raise my hands to elders, knowledge keepers, leaders, First Nations governments, and community members who continue to show us how we can build a better and brighter future together. Let's acknowledge National Indigenous Peoples Day by collectively recommitting to each other to make Canada a better place.
Assalamu alaikum to Islam Unravelled, and I want to thank you for your anti-racism initiative and today's event around the hidden history of First Nations people. I think it's also very pertinent that today is this event is being held on the National Day to celebrate Indigenous culture, history, language, and I think that's incredibly important. The reality is that this is more than ever very pertinent given the recent horrible discovery of 215 kids in unmarked graves in Kamloops and the additional over 100 kids found in Manitoba. And sadly, we know that there will be more kids discovered because residential schools, and it's weird to call them schools because they were institutions designed to kill Indigenous kids, to strip them of their language, their identity, of who they are. And I can only imagine the pain of families, of moms and dads who had their babies, their children stripped from them, these kids who lost all connection to their language and identity, and then lost their lives in institutions designed to kill the Indian in the child and really to kill the child. So that is an important part of our history. We have to know this because it should inspire us to right the wrongs. Many of these harms continue to this day. It's an unbroken legacy of genocide and trauma, which means Indigenous communities are still suffering from the weight and the burden of this ongoing injustice. So acknowledging the history is the first part of healing, knowing what happened, and then we should all commit collectively to fighting for justice. Right now, as we speak, the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau is fighting Indigenous people in court, particularly Indigenous children who were found to have been recklessly and willfully discriminated by the Canadian government, by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, one of the highest tribunals in the land. The fact that the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau is fighting these kids in court is sheer hypocrisy when we have that same Prime Minister say on one hand that he is sorry about the horrible injustice when he is continuing that same legacy by fighting these kids who were discriminated by the Indigenous child welfare system. We know that the Truth and Reconciliation calls for action have been ignored. This government has been in power for 6 years and they failed to implement the vast majority of those calls to action, many of them which would actually have us walk the path of justice. So today's event is very important. And I want you to know, as leader of the New Democratic Party, I will continue to use all the tools that I have, my platform, to fight for justice for the first people of this land, for Indigenous people, for First Nations, Inuit and Métis. They deserve justice. And as a starting point, implementing the calls to action, stop the fights against Indigenous kids in court, and start walking the path of reconciliation with a true priority on making sure Indigenous people have access to clean drinking water, access to healthcare, equal funding, and a future that is based on a partnership where the federal government works in partnership, recognizing the inherent treaty rights, inherent rights of Indigenous people, so that we can build a more prosperous, brighter future where Indigenous people are not subject to injustice, but walk the path of justice and freedom. That's a path that I want to walk, and I'm committed to making that happen. Thank you again for holding today's event. I'm honored to be able to share a couple words with you today. Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yusuf Siraj. I'm with Foundation for a Path Forward and Islam Unravelled Anti-Racism Initiative in British Columbia. We are BC's official faith-based community convener for anti-racism initiatives, working in partnership with Resiliency BC and the province of BC. I'm here today with my colleague and friend, Tarek Tayeb, who is a co-founder of both organizations, as well as a vice president with the BC Muslim Association and a director of the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services. We are privileged to be hosting this event in partnership with Norm Leach, the executive director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center. And I'm calling in today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, for whom we are incredibly grateful for the years and centuries for which they took care of this land. And we're grateful for the opportunity to partner with them in building a brighter future for everyone on it. And we appreciate the comments from our federal and provincial leaders on National Indigenous Peoples Day. And to continue, our first speaker today, MLA Olson is a MLA with the Green Party of Canada. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly for Saanich North in the Islands in 2017. He's been an interim leader of the Green Party twice, first from 2013 to 2015, and again from January to September in 2020. Adam is an entrepreneur, a networker, and a community builder. He tackles challenges straight on and is tireless in his efforts. For the past 7 years, Adam has been a facilitator and an advocate committed to good governance and improving public participation to strengthen all aspects of community and province. Adam is also a member of the Sarluk First Nations. Adam?
Yeah, it's Quachel. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here this evening with you, Yusuf and Tariq, and to all of the guests who will speak at this beautiful event this evening. And I also share the previous speakers' gratitude to you both and to your organizations for the incredibly important work that you do in anti-racism and making sure that we have these important conversations and that we're a part of as citizens, a part of the important work of justice and ensuring that Indigenous people, here we are today on National Indigenous Peoples Day, but all people of color and in our country have a good experience in their life and not the experiences that I think that we're coming to reconcile. This is the history of Indigenous Crown relations in our province. I have the good fortune of being able to represent Saanich North in the Islands as a BC Green MLA, not a Green Party of Canada MLA, a BC Green MLA. But I also have the good fortune of being part of a community that has Chief Don Tom, the Vice President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, as our chief here, the home chief. And so Don and I have grown up together, and it's quite inspiring to see him, and I pass along his regrets for not being able to attend. And as I often say about the Indigenous leaders in our province and across our country, that they are some of the most powerful leaders that we have in our country. I don't know that many people understand the portfolio of responsibilities that someone like Chief Tom and his colleagues at council on the council here in Sartlip have to manage. They manage international relations with our federal government. They manage interprovincial relations with our provincial government and all of the portfolios that fall underneath the 20 ministries within our provincial government: education, healthcare, child and family services, environment. All of those responsibilities land on the chief and council of our community. But they also are responsible for all of the local government, what we would see at our municipal governments: land use, land planning, governance between the relationships of our families. And I would challenge any of my colleagues in the provincial government or my colleagues in the federal government to have to manage such a portfolio with so little resources. to have to go cap in hand, day in and day out, to the federal and provincial governments. So when we hear our provincial and elected politicians and our federal elected politicians acknowledge the work that we have ahead, it really does come to understanding that Indigenous leaders do more today with less than any other leader in our country. And it's remarkable the work that they do, and we have to hold them up and lift them up, and the power that they have, and they're really, really incredible. I really like to thank the leader of the federal NDP, Jagmeet Singh, for his straightforward talk, for speaking truth to the power that is in our country and speaks to the provincial government as well. I've really appreciated Jagmeet Singh's ability to cut straight to the core of what it is that we need to be speaking to talk about racism in a way that reflects how people feel when they are the survivor of racist treatment. And I really appreciate his willingness to stand up and to create discomfort, because it's that discomfort that my family and my relatives have felt every day, day in and day out, being an Indigenous person in this country. Discomfort being in your own territories, discomfort being in your own places. And so today, well, National Indigenous Peoples Day is a different day every year for me. This year, it's one of reflection and it's one of mourning. Our communities are still in mourning from those babies that were found, that we all knew were there, but that were acknowledged. And I see Canada finally waking up to this. And I think that it's important to recognize that as Canada and Canadians awaken to the reality of our history, that those resources that Indigenous nations need to be able to indeed do all of that work, to effectively negotiate with different crown governments over the rights and title that those crown governments speak so easily about in words, that they see that recognition, is that we understand that of the billions of dollars that are extracted from these unceded territories each and every year, that Indigenous people see very little, if any, of that. And so when we're working to build our healing centers, and when we're working to build our houses of governance and culture, the longhouses, whatever they look like across the country, now is the time for the federal and provincial governments to recognize that the benefit that they've been extracting from these territories off of the backs of Indigenous land, it's now time to have a different approach. It's easy to say these words, it's easy to say these things. It's very difficult for those people in power to be able to give up any of it. And so I encourage my colleagues in the provincial government, Premier Horgan, all of his cabinet, to follow through on the commitments of the rhetoric with the actions. We have an action plan in British Columbia with dozens and dozens of actions, and I look forward to working with this government over the next 3.5 years and long into the future to ensure that the government follows through on the commitments that it's made. So that when we are celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day, that we're doing it and recognizing the incredible contributions that Indigenous people make and Indigenous cultures make to the lands, and that we're celebrating the change from the colonial perspectives that have gripped this country for decades and centuries. With that, I thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I'll continue to stand in the legislature as my federal colleague, or my federal political colleague, I should say, speaks so clearly and straightforward way about the situation that we face, and I'll continue to do that in the BC legislature as well. And a lot of love to all of the families, all of our families, some of the families that I see represented here, but all of our Indigenous families across the province and the country, as you go through your processes in mourning to reconcile within yourselves the history of the residential school and the impacts of the Indian Act that it's had on us, that there are people that will continue to stand up and speak to the governments to ensure that we see justice. And it's just a lot of love and compassion that I have for the mourning that our families are in now for this National Aboriginal Day, which is normally a day of celebration, but I think today it's a day of reflection, acknowledgement, recognition, and a day of mourning. Kasiyam for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. We really appreciate you sharing your voice and your words with us and being the person to start off this event. I think, you know, you set the tone and set the stage for what we're really trying to achieve here, which is to bring allyship to address these incredibly difficult systemic and individual challenges that the First Nations community, our first community here in Canada, continues to face. And as we ask our next speaker, the Honorable Bardes Chugger, Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth, to speak next, I'll just give her a brief introduction. So Minister Chugger is actually Canada's first ever Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. She has sat at the cabinet table from the beginning of our current Trudeau government, including stints as Minister for Small Business and the government House Leader. So lots of experience in how politics and real life kind of can mix together. She considers herself part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms generation and has participated in policy conference on many issues, including the advancement of same-sex marriage rights and a national manufacturing strategy to help protect the Canadian economy and well-being. Minister Chugger, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. I say this because recognizing the land that we live on is a small but essential step towards reconciliation. And we should all keep in mind that aside from Indigenous peoples, we are all settlers. I want to thank my friends from Islam Unravelled for inviting me to speak at this prestigious event, and thank my friend and colleague, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, as well as all Liberal members, federal Liberal members of Parliament, for having me join you virtually in British Columbia today. I look forward to the day that we can be together, not virtually, but in person. I also want to express my condolences and appreciation to the elders, chiefs, and Indigenous peoples on this panel today and listening in. It continues to take strength to participate when tragedies remain still so present. La pandémie de COVID-19 nous a tous rappelé que nous avons encore du travail à faire. Elle a touché l'ensemble des Canadiens et Canadiennes et de façon disproportionnée certains segments de la population, y compris les communautés autochtones, noires et racisées, et les communautés avec la diversité sexuelle et la diversité de genre. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us all that we still have more work to do. It has affected all Canadians and disproportionately certain segments of the population, including Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, and sexual and gender diverse communities. We've seen that the pandemic has exposed inequities and has fueled racism in this country and around the world. Asian communities are being targeted based on prejudice and hatred. Islamophobia, especially against women and girls, is still rampant in many cities. And Indigenous peoples continue to face racism every day. These instances are simply heartbreaking and unacceptable. I believe that the theme of this panel, honoring our pre-colonial history to guide systemic change for a shared racism-free future, is exactly what my work at the cabinet table has been focused on. Advocating for diverse communities and ensuring that our government is working to advance policies, legislation, and actions that contribute to a better country and a better future. I want you all to know that I don't take this responsibility lightly, and I recognize that it is a big undertaking. But doing it in collaboration with you all and hearing from your lived experiences will give me the insight we need to move the needle further along. Marking National Indigenous Peoples Day is important for recognizing and honoring the achievements, the histories, and culture of Indigenous peoples across these lands. I say histories to mark the discrepancies that still exist between what I was taught in school and what was the reality for many. We are still learning about the history of this country, unlearning some of the history that we were taught. And although the pain of the past is still felt today, we must continue the important work to build a better future. My colleague, Minister Carolyn Bennett, recognized that when she said that all Canadians need to learn about the perseverance and resilience of Indigenous peoples and the importance of protecting Indigenous knowledge and revitalizing their languages and culture. We know that the scope of action that is needed is vast, and through our engagements with Indigenous partners, we've heard loud and clear that culture is foundational and all-encompassing. It is at the heart of one's identity and self-worth, and it is necessary for healing, safety, and empowerment. Over the last year, we have witnessed unprecedented global protests against racism and injustice, and more people are uniting to bring to the forefront the devastating impact of racism in Canada and around the world. Je veux que vous sachiez que ce gouvernement dirigé par ce Premier ministre Justin Trudeau est déterminé à faire ce travail. I want you to know that this government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is committed to do this work. I'm very grateful for being here with you today. I look forward to continuing our work to build an even better and consciously more inclusive society for all. One of the things I'm proudest about is actually working in partnership with Indigenous communities. The Ottawa knows best top-down approach is not our path forward. We will work in a meaningful way with two-way dialogue because Indigenous leadership knows what is needed and the federal government is here to be a partner. Thank you. Ahe. Assalamu alaikum. Merci.
Alaikum salam, Minister. Thank you for your kind words and for joining us today. One of the things we think is so important is to bring together all the stakeholders, to learn from each other, to hear from each other. And we appreciate you and being here with us today. Our next speaker is Kasari Govinder. She is British Columbia's first independent human rights commissioner. From 2008 till 2019, Commissioner Govinder held leadership positions at West Coast Leaf and was appointed executive director in 2011. She has co-authored key reports and articles and speaks widely on critical social issues such as hate speech, access to justice, gender-based violence, systemic racism, and Indigenous rights. Thank you for joining us, Commissioner.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and thank you to all of you who are listening in through various means. It's a pleasure to be here with all of my fellow panelists. In non-COVID times, as Adam mentioned earlier, I think this would be a celebratory day. I live close to Trout Lake here in Vancouver, where the what was the National Indigenous Day celebrations would happen. So normally I would be happily eating bannock in the park and watching drumming with my child, but I am actually very happy to be here with all of you in this moment and having this virtual celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. Before I continue, I do want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As the descendant of migrants and settlers, I am grateful to the Coast Salish peoples who have cared for these lands and these waters for generations. This gratitude comes with a responsibility, of which we have recently had a stark reminder, to bear witness to the pain that continues to unfold as a result of Canada's colonial structures, such as a residential school system. I want to acknowledge the news of the last few weeks from now a growing number of nations, but starting with Kamloops to Secwepemc territory, has been devastating, and that words seem insufficient, but also necessary. And I want to recognize the attendant responsibility that the discovery, the confirmation of the graves that so many have talked about for so long, places on us non-Indigenous people and our public institutions to bear witness and to dismantle these harmful structures in large and small ways. As BC's Human Rights Commissioner, I am an independent officer of the legislature, much like the Ombudsperson or the Auditor, with the mandate to address the root causes of inequality, injustice, and discrimination in BC, including by promoting compliance with international human rights obligations. And I emphasize that my role is independent from government, and my job is much like being a watchdog for the provincial government to ensure compliance with international human rights as well as our systemic mandate, the inclusion of international law in the scope of our human rights work, makes my office unique among human rights commissions in the country. Key to this role as Human Rights Commissioner is a focus on decolonization and on Indigenous rights. And I'm honored to be here with you to mark this day. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about the state of Indigenous rights here in BC. Indigenous people, as you've heard already through some of the speakers, continue to face significant inequality. We know that Indigenous people are far overrepresented in jails, and that, for example, Indigenous women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated people. In 2019-2020, Indigenous youth accounted for nearly 50% of all youth admitted to custody in BC. We know as well that the legacy of state interference with Indigenous families continues today in the overrepresentation of children in the child protection system. The National Inquiry called the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women a genocide of gendered and racialized violence. It is in this context that COVID-19 has amplified racial tensions and fueled hatred, extremism, and the rise of authoritarianism. The virus has exacerbated poverty, homelessness, hunger, mental illness, and domestic abuse. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has spread hate along with the virus, and we've witnessed an increase in violent acts against marginalized communities, particularly Asian Canadian and Indigenous communities. And although the impact of COVID itself on the basis of race and ethnicity is still largely unknown in BC due to a lack of data collection, not unknown elsewhere in the country, we do know that the impact on First Nations peoples has been significant, even here in BC. For example, First Nations people in the north of BC have confirmed COVID-19 cases at twice the rate of non-Indigenous people in that region. And that rate is 2.5 times higher in the Island Health region. Rather than an indication of some kind of inherent vulnerability, these high numbers are a result of poverty, overcrowding, health inequities leading to comorbidities, and a lack of resources in many communities. Committing to decolonization entails understanding the many ways in which colonial structures continue to be detrimental to the lives, well-being, and rights of Indigenous people. In my work, it also means using the tools available to us, such as the human rights system and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to continue the push for change. It is in this spirit, for example, that we're currently doing significant research on systemic racism in policing and anticipate releasing a report with our recommendations in coming months. We've also been working for the past year to encourage all public institutions, particularly the provincial government, to collect race-based and other disaggregated data to ensure that all public policy is based on real lived experiences, including anti-Indigenous racism. Doing the work of human rights means feeling the weight of generations of pain and the responsibility to combat oppression and discrimination in all its forms. But in another way, doing human rights work, doing decolonizing work, is a celebration of what's possible. And I think we have to believe in the power of what's possible. We have to draw on our well of optimism, if we can find it, to feel this work is worthwhile and to do it with any impact. It's perhaps an overused quote at this point, but I love it anyway. Arundhati Roy once said, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." More recently, she said, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with their past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." I've had the opportunity to meet with a number of nations and Indigenous organizations in recent months. And I was struck recently, actually in the week after the discovery of the bodies at Kamloops Residential School, where meeting with one band, a council member talked about his hope in this moment, for how the conversation was shifting, for how optimistic he was that settlers were finally waking up and wanting to learn more, and that things were beginning to shift. And his comment was a reminder to me that hope can be a radical act in times like this. That holding this optimism is not a matter of turning our faces away from inequities and injustices. It's not a matter of putting our head in the sand, but can be rather a means of facing them head on. It's a means of imagining our world anew. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here with all of you, and I wish happy National Indigenous Day, National Indigenous Peoples Day, I'm sorry, to all of you listening. Thank you, take care.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Govinder. It's wonderful to know that British Columbia has someone such as yourself in this incredibly important role of a human rights commissioner to really be looking into where we can improve, where we can fix the systemic difficulties that have been passed down from generation to generation, to stop them from occurring and to make it better for everyone. So again, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for being here with us, and we appreciate your voice and your time. Our next speaker was actually going to be our co-host for this event. So Norm Leach from the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center was going to be speaking. So he's the executive director. Unfortunately, there was just some personal challenges that he was unable to get out of. However, on his behalf, I'll just say a few words about the organization because they're doing incredible work on the ground for First Nation communities. So the VAC-PSCS was incorporated in 2006 as a nonprofit society by the Vancouver Aboriginal community itself. It was created to address social justice issues, improve safety for Aboriginal people, and build the relationships between organizations, institutions, provincial, federal, municipal, and the Aboriginal community through education, awareness, and open dialogue. The positive link between the Vancouver Aboriginal community and the law enforcement in Vancouver, such as the BPD, provides an avenue to engage and support Aboriginal people to better understand and really utilize the services of the BPD. So this link provided by the VACPC is one that's really helping on the ground for Aboriginal people to better understand and be served by the organizations that exist to help and protect them. It's one of the most impactful organizations that we've personally had the pleasure of meeting over the last few years, especially in the Indigenous community. Their mandates really align with what I think people really want to see on the ground from such organizations. For instance, to reduce overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in at-risk circumstances, to build community support and participation for community policing and safety issues. They also offer healing and wellness training. They follow an Aboriginal code of ethics, which is trying to disassociate from the colonized perspective of what is or not ethical within a society in all their decision-making, and encouraging that to be part of something that is anti-racist and a decision-making process throughout society. Their cultural sensitivity, preparation, and diversity programs are being offered to not just Indigenous communities, but also the public. And they're looking to secure resources through the government private sector foundation to maintain, improve, and enhance this programming. It is very important that we support the organizations that Indigenous communities themselves have built. We are here as settler allies, and we are doing the work of allyship. But in essence, we have to let them take the lead. And part of that is through highlighting the great work being done by such organizations and with such great leaders as Norm Leach. So just a brief overview of the kind of the perspective of today. So many people around the world we're addressing issues of justice and human rights for Indigenous people. The point of these types of days is to build awareness on the challenges that are being faced. So National Indigenous Peoples Day is one that really can help highlight both the challenges, but also the opportunities to help change the narrative for Indigenous peoples around the world, but particularly here in Canada. In light of that recent horrific discovery of the bodies of 215 Indigenous children buried at a residential school in Kamloops, horrific because it's, you can't imagine it being your own family, that your kids were taken from you and then you never saw them again. And then there's probably parents alive now who this is the first time they actually know what happened to their children. And it's terrible.
So when that news broke, the vision for this event shifted slightly in order to encourage people to share their voices and lived experiences in addressing anti-Indigenous discrimination and systemic racism as a whole, while also acknowledging that the root of anti-Indigenous racism and part of the ongoing discrimination towards Indigenous people is the system of colonization that's continuously running challenges and oppression on both the unceded territories and Indigenous peoples. These systems are non-personal. They are not something that any one person is doing, but they've been built up over hundreds of years. And I know at all levels of government and across our country, there's many great people, such as those on this call, who are working tirelessly to dismantle that and to rebuild it with something better for all Canadians. However, this is not just a problem from generations ago. In Canada, according to census data, 52% of children in foster care are Indigenous, while accounting for only 7% of the total child population. These kind of discrepancies are what we need to look at as why these things keep happening for a specific segment of our population, right? The Indigenous peoples continuously face such discrimination. For instance, Dr. Toupé-Lafon's November 2020 report, In Plain Sight, described findings of widespread systemic racism against Indigenous people in the BC healthcare system. 84% of Indigenous peoples describe personal experiences of racism and discrimination that discourage them from seeking necessary care in the future and reduce their access to care, which negatively affected their health and had a cascading effect of negative outcomes. These outcomes just end up reinforcing stereotypes and perpetuate the cycle of inequality. A 2014 report by the RCMP titled Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a National Operational Overview, found that more than 1,000 Indigenous women were murdered over a span of 30 years. And that's just the ones that were in the report. From 2001 to 2015, the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada, which is horrible to have to read, was 6 times as high as the homicide rate for other women. Across Canada, First Nations communities are working to heal, though. They're working to overcome this generational trauma that colonization and the system of colonization inflicted upon them and their families. Now, as settlers, we are doing, and we believe it is a moral imperative, to do the necessary work of allyship, to highlight the hidden history, voices, and truth of First Nations people. And we'd like to invite you to join elders, community leaders, cultural leaders, and elected officials on trying to make this happen within our lifetimes. It's something that we should aspire to being a solved problem, whereas the discrimination, the racism, the oppression stops. Part of that healing process is the spiritual healing. Our next speaker, Mufti Asim Rashid, is going to be talking about that perspective. Mufti Asim is a graduate from Brunei Islamic University at Brunei with a master's degree in Islamic studies. He is an internationally renowned Islamic scholar and speaker. He's also the founder of Al Ihsan Educational Foundation, which offers Islamic education in BC. He's also the founder of Islam Unravelled, which is an anti-racist education and engagement organization. Mufti Asim, please, it's your turn, sir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings and welcome to all our esteemed guests and respective viewers and listeners. Honestly, this occasion is it is a day for us to not just acknowledge and commemorate the original custodians of Canada, but to me, this should be an opportunity to let them voice their narrative in their own words, from their own perspective. And in relation to that, to have a systemic effort to give them their voice, their narrative in all in all contexts where it is required. We heard one of the guests, Minister Chagras, talking about the difference between what we studied in school growing up and what we heard when we started receiving what should be called the original and the correct narrative from the perspective of from the descendants of those people that are meant that we learn about, the tribes and the nations that we read about when studying Canadiana. I think one of the greatest things that we can give from our side, being outsiders, first is the opportunity for our Indigenous friends, brothers and sisters, to voice their narrative, their history, from their perspective, and this should be done in an official way. Right now, it's happening in the form of events like this, in various on various platforms and through various programs. But I think the official narrative that is taught in every single school across Canada should be the narrative that comes from the perspective of the Indigenous people. That is, ethically speaking, morally speaking, the only valid narrative. People who have looked after this land for since time immemorial, and then through various methods which were pretty much the hallmark or the trademark of Western colonialism, they were put into that situation, manipulated in various ways, control of the land, control of the resources, which hold a sacred sort of symbolism in their belief system, and from people who looked after the land and everything in it with such care and with such love, to have all of that stripped away and still not being able to hear things openly from their side, or let's say officially from their side. I think this is one of the greatest things that was taken away, that someone else wrote their story for them in words and with facts, or perspectives that were convenient for the outsiders to place and present. And when we're talking about all of these facts and figures that have been presented, whether it's systemic racism, bias, being marginalized, being subject to to greater risks in all aspects of life than other communities. It's an injustice upon an injustice. And then you take their voice away, and what they're saying is only transmitted to a very, very small circle of people who are actually trying to understand them better, trying to help them out, but really it's still not mainstream. It needs to become mainstream. It needs to become the curriculum. I am, by and large, an educator, and so I design curriculum and syllabi, and I write textbooks, and I implement educational systems. So this is something that I hold very dearly to my heart, that ultimately, what is the narrative that is being delivered through that system, and what will be the outcomes? You've all heard about social engineering of various types. This is one major form of it, the mainstream education. I cannot emphasize this enough. And those books need to be written by the Indigenous people. That whole history of Canada, the colonization aspect of it, what the treaties really looked like, what was the impression given when those treaties were made, what preceded them, and what were the emotions at that time? What were the Indigenous people feeling at that time? What was the the emotional climate. All of this needs to come out, and it cannot come out from correctly from the outsider's view. It just can't. So one of the greatest things we can take away from a nation is their voice, their narrative, their story, and then take it over and then pretend like that's the truth. And you know, it sounds an awful lot like what's happening with Islam and Muslims around the world. So we feel this. Our voice was taken away. Our story was taken away, and it was taken over by people who just wanted greater viewership, greater readership, and they just wanted, you know, it was more about the storyline than about the story, and till this day we struggle to find our voice and make our voice heard amidst criticisms that we don't hear the Muslims speaking. It's because other people are trying to speak on our behalf, and their voice is being broadcasted around the world. The other thing is that, you know, in taking steps towards reconciliation, it is important that we put the indigenous people at the center of all discussions. Their needs, their difficulties and problems. We can talk about reconciliation. We can have an official acknowledgement for the traditional and original custodians of our land. We can mention their tribes by name, and this is important. However, if we do not take significant and measurable steps towards eliminating the problems that the outsiders or the settlers have created for them, then we have not done anything close to justice. And it will not be a true and genuine step towards reconciliation. You have to look after the problems first. We're hearing facts and figures all the time. Many have been presented right here in terms of crime, in terms of medical health. I don't think we've talked about emotional health just yet, but if you look at the figures, the statistics of suicides, especially of teenagers, especially of young people, and you know, and look at it in perspective, just like the other statistics were laid out, you'll find that the numbers are shocking. It's unfair. It's unfair. And if we do not, as I said, if we do not take significant and measurable steps to reverse the damage that has been caused, then our silence or our inactivity in this makes us, you know, like silent partners, like people who are condoning it, just because we're not doing anything to change it. You know, in one hadith, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Help your brother, whether he be the oppressor or he is oppressed." So his companions asked, "Yes, we will definitely help him if he is being oppressed. But how do we help him when he's the oppressor? Because you must stop him from his oppression. That is his help." So taking steps to remove oppression and injustice as it stands right now, and creating systems that put people in a certain position is also a part of injustice and oppression. So these statistics that we are reading about and hearing about need to come down. And that's one of the, you know, that would be one of the metrics that I would say gives us a measure of what, you know, of what efforts are actually being made. The statistics are significant. They need to come down in all of the areas. And let's put them at the forefront. Let's put their needs, first of all, the difficulties that they're going through. Let's put those at the forefront, and then let's bring them to the forefront as, you know, as a respected and honorable and, you know, and very, very valuable part of our society, without which we cannot really be complete. So these are just a couple of points. And look, the trend for Western colonialism is, it's pretty consistent across all of the countries that were colonized. And, you know, it brings to mind, just in closing, I'll mention a statement in the Quran. There's a very famous story about Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It's mentioned in all the biblical texts in the Hebrew Bible and in the Bible, and even in texts outside the Bible. And it's mentioned in a lot of detail in the Quran. And when when the Queen of Sheba, Bilqis, was consulting her court about this is the message that has come from Solomon, what should we do? She said, look, there's one thing that I know. Innal muluka, when kings or people with the intention of gaining power and rule, whenever they go to a land, afsaduha, they do two things. Afsaduha wa ja'alu a'izzata ahliha adillah. They always cause damage to that land. They cause significant disruption to that land. They take the honorable people, the honorable residents and dwellers of that land, people who were held in high esteem by that nation, and they lower them and they disgrace them. They take away their esteem, their prestige, their respect, and they put them into a position where they become impoverished, they become weak, and they lose everything that they had. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what a reversal is required for as a significant step towards reconciliation. So thank you for so much for your time. Actually, I don't feel like I deserve to speak at this forum. This is someone else's forum. It should be someone else's voice, someone else's narrative and their story. It's all about them. We are just here to voice our concerns, our solidarity, and our support. And we are ready to do from our platform, Islam Unravelled, we are ready to do whatever it takes to play a role in this. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khair, Mufti Asam. I think that really touched everyone's hearts, because this is what it really is about. It's when we realize that when we stand for others, that we can really change things together. Together we can. And as Muslims, it is our faith-based understanding, as in many faith traditions, that we have to stand for those whose rights have been violated. Interesting thing that I'll share with everyone is that in British Columbia, there's no treaties, or there's not many. It's unceded territories, which means it was just taken. So our mosques are actually based and located and hosted on unceded or stolen land. And one of the challenges with that is that prayers offered on trespassed or stolen land, there's a difficulty. They might not be accepted because of that injustice being committed. So what we've done is to reach out to our First Nations brothers, sisters, and friends to really help to heal as we are new settlers to this land, and show them that respect and understanding of that this is actually theirs. So thank you, Mufti Asam. It's always appreciated to hear your wisdom and your voice. Our next speaker today is the Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Minister Wilkinson has served as a Member of Parliament for North Vancouver since 2015. My whole family actually voted for him in 2015, back when we lived in North Vancouver, so it's lovely to see him again. Minister Wilkinson spent more than 20 years in the private sector, holding leadership positions with a number of companies dedicated to development of green technologies. And green technologies have such an important role to play in addressing the climate crisis, which does affect Indigenous people around the world disproportionately. He is a Rhodes Scholar, and he has served on several industry and climate charitable boards, including the United Way of Lower Mainland, the BC Technology Industry Association, and the BC chapter of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. Minister Wilkinson, thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you very much. Hello, bonjour, Tanoya. I am joining you from North Vancouver, which, as many will know, is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I certainly want to thank Islam Unravelled for hosting this event and for inviting me to say a few words. We have experienced some very difficult times of late. When I say difficult times, I am certainly in part referring to the pandemic, which has caused frustration, dislocation, emotional and financial hardship, and loss for many. But I'm also referring to other more recent events, including those that have taken place in London and in Kamloops. The tragedy that occurred recently in London was horrific and shocked the conscience of Canadians. It was an act of hate, an act of domestic terrorism against a Canadian family of Muslim faith. And I think I personally, and I know all of you, stand in solidarity with the people of London and with Canada's Muslim community. We must stand against hate and xenophobia and reflect on what can be done through education, public policy, and through our own behaviors to ensure that something like this does not happen again. In Kamloops, the discovery of 215 children's remains at a former residential school were deeply, deeply disturbing for many, many Canadians. While we have been aware of the shameful legacy of the residential school system in this country for some time, this discovery brought home, I think, just how appalling the conditions and the treatment of many Indigenous children were. The reverberations of the residential school system continue to be felt in many, many communities to this day. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are resilient, but we have much to do to repair the damage, to address the centuries-old wounds, and to define and walk a path towards healing. This clearly is a time when we must all look to do what we can to support others, and a time in which we should engage in important conversations regarding racism, prejudice, and discrimination in our society. Today, as you will all know, is Indigenous Peoples Day, and we are gathered virtually to celebrate the hidden history of Indigenous peoples. And this is something on which I actually have been quite focused on in my capacity as Minister responsible for Parks Canada, which is something I get to do in addition to environment and climate change. One of the important roles that I am privileged to play as Minister is to work closely with the Historic Sites and Monuments Board on the commemoration of important events in the history of this country. It is very clear that we must collectively acknowledge that the way in which and the events on which we have traditionally focused has been very much to the exclusion of the history of Indigenous peoples and the history of other racialized communities in Canada. Going forward, we must strive to ensure a more inclusive approach to commemorating the history of Canada, both the good and the more challenging. Over the past year, a few things that we've done in this regard would include the designation of the residential school system as an event of national historic significance, as well as the designation of 2 former residential schools as national historic sites, very much in partnership with local First Nations. These are part of the federal government's response to Call to Action 79 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. During this past year, we also announced 4 new designations that recognize the national historic significance of persons and events associated with Black history in this country. Canada and the concept of Canada remain very much a work in progress. As some commentators have said, Canada is perhaps the world's first postmodern state, a state that to survive and thrive must ensure the thoughtful consideration of and the celebration of differences, a state that can and must recognize that the celebration of various cultures can and should in fact make us richer and stronger. The inspiration for and the work of Islam Unravelled is precisely about building a more inclusive, a richer, and a stronger Canada. Its focus on education and engagement is very much to be applauded and supported. Aujourd'hui, à l'occasion de la Journée nationale des peuples autochtones et tous les jours, nous devrions nous engager à poursuivre le chemin de la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones et à travailler à bâtir une société plus inclusive et plus juste pour tous les Canadiens. Today, on National Indigenous Peoples Day and every day, let us all rededicate ourselves to continuing to walk the path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and to work to build a more inclusive and a more just society for all Canadians. So thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. Merci. Wachuyo.
Merci, Minister. Thank you again for being with us this afternoon. It is appreciated, and the work you're doing at the national level to help find solutions for these shared challenges that we're facing. It's appreciated, and the voice that you're bringing on behalf of not only the government, but personally, I'm sure that this is what it takes to have real change, is caring people who are willing to listen and who are willing to work in partnership and allyship with communities affected by these challenges. So thank you very much, sir. Part of the theme that we always try to bring to these events is that of united allyship. And in that line, we are going to hear next from the president of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, Amy Go. Ms. Go is a social worker by training, and was past president of the Chinese Canadian National Council. She is also the executive director of Yihong Center for Geriatric Care, and she was one of the founders of Care Center for Internationally Educated Nurses in Ontario. She was on the board of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, as well as the National Organization of Immigrant and Visible Minority Women, and many, many other organizations. We're honored to have you here with us tonight, Amy. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting CCNCSJ to this very important event on National Indigenous Peoples Day, especially at this time when we can take this opportunity to express our solidarity and our condolences to the Indigenous communities over the discovery of the 215 and other children found in unmarked graves in Kamloops and other places. I am grateful, truly grateful, to be joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Let me start with my own personal journey. I came to Canada in 1980 and started my university education. I did not learn anything about colonization or the genocide of Indigenous communities in my undergraduate studies, nor in my graduate studies in social work. I was particularly interested in social policies, but I'd never learned about, there was no courses at all that talked about the systemic racism, the colonization, and the impact of all those on racialized or Indigenous communities or Black or Asian Canadian communities. It was actually through my activism and involvement in CCNC that I came to learn about the long history of connections between Chinese settlers and the Indigenous communities. Starting in mid-1800s, Chinese gold miners were accepted by the Indigenous communities and had lived side by side in the broader hostile world of white colonists. When the Chinese laborers who were shunned by the white communities after the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, linking our country from coast to coast, many of these workers again found refuge in the Indigenous communities. They were welcomed and accepted as who they were by the Indigenous communities. So as Chinese Canadians, we really owe the Indigenous communities a heartfelt thank you. So CCNC initiated a redress campaign for Head Tax and Exclusion Act in the 1980s. I remember very well the redress conferences that I attended in those days, where I learned for the first time the extremely painful and traumatic accounts from families of children of residential schools that never returned. I also learned that the South African government studied our Indian Act and Indian reserves to help establish their apartheid regime. I was ashamed, I was angry, I was extremely stressed. In 1988, Japanese Canadian communities obtained redress for the internment of Japanese during the Second World War. Then Chinese Canadian communities, we also received our apology and redress from the federal government on June 22nd, 2006. Yes, tomorrow marks the 15th anniversary of the redress and apology. Yet, our first peoples in Canada that have been stripped of the rights, their land, their livelihood, their culture, and their language, and continue to be dehumanized, are still waiting for reconciliation and justice. The pandemic in this last year and a half has certainly amplified and exacerbated anti-Asian racism. Chinese and other East Asian Canadians are becoming more aware of racism and its impact. However, we should also take the time to educate ourselves about our role in perpetuating anti-Indigenous racism, our own biases, our discrimination, and our responsibility in sustaining a society that continues to deny Indigenous rights. Chinese and Asian Canadians really need to understand and acknowledge how systemic racism, colonialism, and white supremacy collectively and distinctly impact on Indigenous, Black, Asian, and other racialized communities. As an activist, I continue to learn about Indigenous rights and how to be an ally. I learn from the leaders of Indigenous communities that I need to approach things with humility, that I need to approach as an ally with humility. So recently we were asked to speak on an issue about the rights of Asian sex workers because the Ontario government was going to propose an anti-trafficking legislation, and unfortunately it was passed. We were asked to speak up in solidarity with Asian sex workers because the legislation would have devastating impact on them. So my colleagues and I at CCNC wanted to find out how would the Indigenous communities react to that legislation, given that over 50% of all the women trafficked in Canada are from the Indigenous communities. So CCNC's position has to be aligned with the Indigenous communities, particularly with the Indigenous women's groups and the recommendations, of course, from the Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So CCNCSJ is committed to advancing this awareness amongst Chinese and Asian Canadian communities about the impact of colonialism on Indigenous communities and the call for reconciliation and justice. We are ensuring that all of our anti-Asian, and anti-racism training materials start with the conversations and the discussions about Indigenous rights and the call for actions for reconciliation and justice. We are committed to calling out anti-Indigenous racism, and we are committed to working in solidarity with Indigenous communities with humility to ensure that all the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, are put into actions. So thank you very much again, and I wish you all a very happy National Indigenous Peoples Day.
Shishi, Amy, thank you for sharing your voice with us today and being part of the wall of allies that we're building to address the issues that we all face together. None more so than the first people of this land, the Indigenous community. Well, we have highlighted the role of allyship and heard from some First Nations Indigenous representation, such as my good friend Adam. The bulk of what we're doing here today is to listen. It's to listen to what is going on with our brothers and sisters and friends in the First Nations community, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, to understand from their own perspective, in their own words, uncensored and without any limits, what they feel needs to be done to protect themselves, their culture, their children, and their futures. Our next speaker, Lorelei Williams, is a past coordinator at VA CPC. She's worked on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, MMIWG, epidemic, and has been described as which has been described as a Canadian national crisis and a genocide. A national inquiry, which was launched in 2015, which resulted in the Reclaiming Power in Place report, calls for transformative legal and social changes to resolve the crisis that has devastated Indigenous communities across the country. Lorelei is raising awareness and advocating for victims and families of MMIWG through an organization called Butterflies in Spirit. It's a dance group she formed in 2012. The group is composed of family members of MMIWGs and was formed with the goal of empowering Indigenous women within her community, as well as within the Indigenous community, and raising awareness about the women who went missing, including her own aunt, Belinda Williams, who went missing in 1978, and her cousin, Tanya Holek, who was murdered in 1996. Lorelei was the original women's coordinator at the VACPC and grew to become a powerful advocate for the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She continues her work through Butterflies in Spirit, the dance group she founded, and also in various other community projects. Lorelei, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. First, I would like to acknowledge the territories that I'm calling in from, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I am grateful to be here on their territories. My name is Lorelei Williams. I am from Shkati Nations on my mom's side. It's the Alis on my dad's side, which is in the Stalo territories. I do a lot of work around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like you said, my auntie Belinda has been missing since 1978. And my cousin Tanya Holek was murdered by serial killer Robert Pickton. My other aunt was pushed out of a window in the downtown east side. Thankfully, she survived. My other cousin was taken when she was 16 years old and by a different serial killer, Terry Arnold. And she was taken to the mountains and raped by him. Thankfully, he let her go. Thankfully, she got away. The others didn't. The others were murdered. And she lives with survivor's guilt, my cousin Dorina, today. So I do a lot of work around this issue. There were so many flaws in both my missing aunt's case and my cousin Tanya's case. It's all right there. The proof is right there. Tanya's case, you just have to look at the Wally Opal inquiry report. And I think it's called Forsaken. You could see all the flaws there. I am also on the Missing and Murdered Women's Coalition, where we hold the government accountable for the wrongdoings, which is a lot. And this coalition came together because we were shut out of the Wally Opal inquiry. We are over 25 organizations in BC. And yeah, I used to be the women's coordinator for the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center, where I worked with families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, women in violent situations, women in the downtown east side. And I tried to build positive relationships between the community and the police, which was really hard considering our history. However, I felt like all the work that I did with the police went out the window when the police arrested a 12-year-old girl with her grandfather at the bank when they were trying to open a bank account. When I was with Braided Warriors at Renfrew Station who locked down there, and they were in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en against the pipelines. I went there to support them. And when I got there, there were 50 police officers around the corner getting ready to arrest them. I ran over and I let them know what was going on, that there was so many officers coming in to arrest them. And in the end, I ended up getting pushed by an officer. This triggered my trauma. You know, just seeing, first of all, I seen my friend being taken down by the police officers. So many of them piled up on her. This was just recently. And then I lost my cousin, and there's video of this. It's so traumatizing to watch the video. And a police officer came at me and he pushed me, and I lost it. All I was spitting out was stuff about MMIWG. Later on, I thought about it and I was like, wow, they can have 50 officers to go and arrest those youth who are protecting Mother Earth, who are protecting our Indigenous women and girls, but they can't have 50 officers to search for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I do a lot of work. My work followed me. I'm not working at the VACPC anymore, but my work has followed me. And so I've been volunteering with them. I'm still a volunteer there, and I still go out and I search for missing women in the downtown east side. Actually, in BC, I went to Hope a few years ago to search for somebody there. And then I've gone to the States and searched for Penny Robertson, who was also found, unfortunately. She was found bound up to a couple of trees by all of her limbs. And even down there, the police and the coroners tried to deem it a suicide. So the family asked for support. They brought me down there, and that was so hard. That was really hard. So with also with Chantel Moore, who is actually a family member. I'm pretty sure you're all aware of Chantel Moore, who was shot by the police officer. She's actually a relative to two of my dancers in Butterflies in Spirit. And that made me think more about wellness checks. Wellness checks are not good for us. One, they might die. That's the worst one. Wellness checks are not good for us because one, they will actually die. Or two, they'll end up in an institution where they are served pills that they can get addicted to. If they have children, the children will be taken away and thrown into the foster care system. Our children are thrown into the foster care system so easily. The foster care system is a different form of the residential schools. Okay. And we're here to acknowledge those children, to talk about what happened. And I'm grateful for that. I spoke at an event earlier today, early in the morning. And they asked me at the beginning, how are you? And I really thought about that. I'm okay. I'm good. I'm okay. I'm grateful to be here. When the news broke about those kids, it made me realize how lucky I am to be here today, because that could have been my parents. I'm wearing this orange shirt with my parents. They both attended residential school, St. Mary's Residential School in Mission, which is not too far from here. I grew up in an alcoholic home because my mom tried to numb the pain of what happened to her in residential school. My dad, I didn't even know. I had no idea he went to the residential school until after he died. His pain was so bad that he didn't even want to speak about it. And a lot of our people won't speak about this. It's just too hard. I've seen people collapse when they first open up about their experiences in residential school. The first time my mom actually spoke to me about it, I made sure she was going to be okay, because I had seen people collapse in the work that I was doing at VACPC. And I said, Mom, you don't have to tell me, but I would like to know about your experience at residential school. And she looked at me and she's like, okay. But I made sure I told her to. I said, please don't tell me anything if it's going to be too hard. I know it's gonna be hard. And my daughter, she was 5 years old, sitting on the ground in front of us, playing with her toys. And my mom said when she was taken from our reserve that she counted every single mountaintop. Our reserve is way past Whistler. It's past Mount Currie. She said she counted every single mountaintop from there to the residential school in Mission because she wanted to follow those mountains back home. And I just burst into tears looking at my daughter, who was 5 when that was the age that my mom was taken. I couldn't imagine being a mother, my child being ripped away from me like that. I couldn't imagine what the child would have gone through, being ripped away from their parents. This was so hard for me to hear that. You know, I grew up knowing that I couldn't turn the lights out because that's when bad things happened. I couldn't turn the lights out wherever my mom was sleeping. We were not allowed to turn the lights out. She would wake up screaming. Even though she drank, if she was passed out, you know, when people are passed out from drinking, it's really hard for them to wake up. My mom, it didn't matter. Sorry, I'm gonna have to have her now. I forgot where I was. Oh, my mom would also always sleep on a couch. She could never sleep on a bed. She even had a couch in her room sometimes, just so she could sleep on it. So when the news broke of the children, I actually went to Kamloops 3 times. And it wasn't until I was in Kamloops that I realized how strong the grief was, that I was in mourning. It actually felt like it was really close to the pain of when I lost my mom, when my mom died. It was really close to the pain of when my dad died, when my brother died. You know, when my mom died, she died because she had liver failure from drinking so much. When she died, I actually blamed the government for killing my mom. I actually talked to a lawyer and I wanted to charge the government for killing my mom, and then later on my dad as well. But after my mom, I actually talked to a lawyer. And you know, this conference, thank you for this conference. And you know, the topics, addressing systemic racism. I always say this, all the systems are against us. Canada is racist. White men are getting away with murdering our people all the time, all the time. This is why predators will target Indigenous women and girls, because they know that they can get away with it. Canada was so good at hiding the truth. I speak internationally, and at these events internationally, I always hear the same thing. Canada is perfect. I thought Canada was perfect. Why did they target the children? You know, I've been speaking about the genocide. I've been speaking about this for a while. And around the world, they can't believe that they targeted our children. Some of them actually don't think that we exist up here. They think that Canada is white. I get that all the time. And I'm just gonna go on my cell phone. You know, there's a statement from the coalition, because we're talking about systemic racism, and I'm just gonna read it from my phone because I have it here. You know, we had this national inquiry And that draft NAP came out recently. I'm sure you all heard about it. This draft NAP is a further failure by the federal government to provide concrete actions which are urgently required to resolve systemic violence, murder, and disappearance against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. It is a disappointing display of the federal government using nice language and performative action to sidestep accountability. Notably absent is any clear plan for implementation, actions, or timelines, which are said to follow in a complementary document. No release date for such a document has been provided. Key issues identified within the draft NAP include no government accountability, no plan for implementation, lack of consultation with Indigenous women survivors, families, and Indigenous women organizations, failure to meaningfully, sorry, my dog again, implement Bill S3 pending June 3rd release, performative language, short-term priorities, lack of prevention. Addressing the topic of truth, reconciliation, and justice. Truth, yes, the truth is finally coming out about the genocide against my people. It breaks my heart that it took the finding of the unmarked graves of the children for Canadians and the world to start acknowledging the pain, discrimination, and the injustices experienced by us. You know, I walk down the street now and you can clearly tell I'm Indigenous, and people are looking at me differently now. People look at me like they're sad for me. I've gone to get my hair done or my nails done and people are asking me questions about it now. And I've actually gone out of my way to buy Tamara Starblanket's book called Suffer the Little Children, which is a book that legally proves the genocide against our people. And I've given it to them at the nail salon. I give that book out like candy, actually. If somebody really is interested in learning about the genocide against our people, I will gift it to them. And, you know, my dance group, we were gonna perform there. And as I was walking in, a big white guy with a dog apparently looked at me and pulled out a taser. I didn't see the taser. It was actually my other butterfly who's speaking later on, Jacqueline Hanyus, that saw the taser. And it's just like, why, when you look at me, why would you think to pull out a taser? Like, you know, on IG, when I shared a picture of me with a quote about genocide that CPC took, of course, there's some denial on my picture. There was a guy who said something. And just in my classroom last week, I spoke up about some racism from a white guy. And this white lady jumped in. You know, it's already hard for us to speak about this, to be open. And I feel like I have a strong voice. And even for me in the classroom, it was very scary for me to actually say something. And when I finally did, this other white person jumped in and got defensive. The person that I was addressing, he actually apologized right away. He apologized. It was the other white lady that made the whole situation worse than it had to be. You know, her words were, "He's a nice guy." And I was like, I didn't say he wasn't a nice guy. You know, there's a lot of nice people out there, but he's racist in the classroom. He's being racist. His comments are triggering me. And then I even said to her too, you know, you're taking up a lot of space in the classroom as well. You know, this course is about environment, First Nations women, and power and politics. And these two white people were taking up a lot of space. And I finally said something. You know, her and a lot of people across this country need to learn about what white fragility is, because that really bothered me. After class, it was hard for me to go to sleep later that night, and it really bothered me the next day. And I really had to smudge myself ever since that happened. Like for a day and a half, I just kept smudging myself to try to take that away. So this is always happening to us. With reconciliation and justice, there isn't any. You know, with the genocide still happening to our people, with the racism, there isn't any at all. And yeah, I was gonna finish off mentioning Tamara's book, but I already mentioned it, so thank you. And sorry for taking up more time, but I figured Norm didn't come and he would let me take his time. So I knew I was gonna have to speak longer. I felt like 10 minutes wasn't enough. And then when I realized Norm wasn't gonna be here, I thought, oh, I'll just take his time. He's my former boss and I don't think he would mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorelei. And, you know, I think I speak for everyone when I say that our hearts are shaken by this. One thing you mentioned, Norm, one thing he said is that don't pity us because the 1% that survived the European genocide that was conducted by colonialists here, they're not the weakest, they're not the sickest, they're the strongest. They're the most resilient. They're the most who have the most to give. And I think that's how I hope to continue to see the Indigenous peoples here. You know, I'm personally an Egyptian Canadian, and my family in the Middle East, we did suffer colonization as well. And to see that, you know, there is hope. There is hope for a newer future where it doesn't have to be what it was for the last few hundred years. You know, the population of Indigenous communities is growing. That's a sign for hope. If the population built from the most resilient, the strongest people with the most to offer is growing, then there is a future where what was taken unjustly can be taken back and to be made more beautiful. I will say that hospitality and welcome that Indigenous people have offered us has been, you know, unbelievable given what happened to you and your family. And you said something very powerful. You asked if people can imagine what it's like. Can people actually feel what it's like to have your family members walk out and then never see them again? Like just never see them again, to have every woman you know in your personal life to have been either attacked, assaulted, abused, or as what happened to you, killed. I'm going to actually ask, you know, just take a moment of silence, everyone. Just think about it. Can you imagine what it's like just to be someone whose life was so victimized by the system of colonization? So out of respect, I'm just going to ask everyone to take a moment of silence to think about that, to feel what it must be like, because this is our family. This is our human family that it's happening to today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lorelei. Thank you for being here today and sharing your truth. I know it's very difficult and I appreciate you doing so, and I see you smudging. So I will share something with everyone. Smudging ceremony is a purification, and correct me if I'm wrong, purification with smoke and eagle feathers and various, exactly what she's doing. But what is very interesting is that it's almost exactly the same as the wudu that Muslims do, except we use water. We wash our face, over our head, on our arms, over our body. I experienced it once at Langara College, and I was shocked by that similarity. So, you know, I hope that this experience tonight provides, you know, a cathartic moment, and everyone here learns from what you're saying. everyone here, I can definitely speak for myself and Tariq and Mufti Asim. We're committed and double committed and recommitted to our role as settlers and as allies to helping with this challenge that our brothers, sisters, and friends in the Indigenous community continue to face. I'm going to now invite Ron Rice, who will be our next speaker, to talk about some of the work he's doing to actually change this narrative at a systemic and at a personal level. So Ron is the executive director of the Victoria Native Friendship Center, and he's a member of the Cowichan tribes. He has the hereditary name of Wushik, and please correct me if I mispronounce that. I would like to pronounce it correctly. He has lived in Victoria on and off for 25 years, and he's worked all over the world, including in Japan, Korea, China, and Hawaii. And it taught him to consider his and cherish his own heritage, his own culture, with a new way of looking at the world because of the international experience. Previously, he worked with the BC Association of Indigenous Friendship Centers, and he has always been a strong supporter of arts, which is, I think, one of the most powerful ways to share our culture and our worldviews. He's responsible for guiding the VNFC's 50 years of programs and services, 50 plus programs and services, over 100 staff, working on things such as healthcare, education, children, youth, employment, family services, affordable housing, food security, and cultural programs. So really kind of the bedrock of a community. Ron, we greatly appreciate you being here today. It's all yours, sir.
Hi, Tsepka. Thank you all very much. My hereditary name is Wushk. I've been here on and off actually for almost 35 years now at this point. One of the benefits going so late in the agenda is I can spend quite a bit of my time agreeing with so much of what has been said already, and to listen to Lorelei talk about not only the work that she does and what she does with the energy she has for this life in this world, but the deep respect that she has for her family and for those around her and for the other women and the other children. It's inspiring, it's encouraging, and to know that she takes time to care for her own spirit in all of it. It's a beautiful reminder. You know, since the discovery in Kamloops, I've spent a lot of time preparing my staff and sort of bracing ourselves for what the community was going to feel and what the community was going to experience. And through it all, you know, the thing that we saw most was our people were turning to culture, and our people were turning to ceremony, and our people were turning to each other. People were saying things out loud about how they felt. People were turning to their elders to ask them questions that they'd never asked them before. So everything we were preparing ourselves for was overshadowed by all of this beautiful resilience within our culture. I found myself consoling non-Indigenous people more because this is a new trauma for them. As Canadians, this is something that now we all collectively experience. And now that it is, the truth is revealed, I think a lot of our people are feeling vindicated. A lot of these stories were already told about these graveyards. I was speaking with Rai Moran, who's now at the University of Victoria. He was with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and he said there are story after story about men who say as boys they were woken up in the middle of the night to dig holes, and that's it. And nobody said what were the holes for, or how big were the holes, or where were the holes. Just left it, set it there. You've said your truth, next. So it is challenging when you think about imagining them taking your child. My granddaughter, my sister's granddaughter is just turned 5 years old. And you know, there are all of these things where people say, I can't imagine. But imagine being a residential school survivor and them coming to take your 5-year-old. and you know what's going to happen to that 5-year-old for the next 10 years of her life. Imagine then consoling your adult daughter as they come to take your grandchild, and the two of you know what's going to happen to that child for the next 10 or 15 years of her life. It is devastating to think about the system of work camps or slave camps. I think we have to get away from referring to them as schools. There was nothing educational about them. It is very difficult at this time to be going through this as a country, trying to sort of do our work and console the world. And it is something that we have sort of just assumed is sort of part of our role. We're in relationship. And so it is my responsibility to share the burden of some of your trauma. And now this is some of your trauma. So it is hard, but it's something that we're facing now together. You know, there's so many challenges with what's happening right now, and with the way that the country has unfolded, and with the truth as it's coming to light. Normally, I would spend today celebrating as a community. We would gather together, we would sing, we would eat, we would dance. And I've always been very deliberate not to bring politics into the celebration, to bring any pain or suffering. But, you know, this year it felt like it was necessary to address things very squarely, very frankly, and very head-on. So when Islam Unravelled reached out, I paused for a brief moment and decided that yes, I would speak on these matters in this context on this day that we normally celebrate ourselves and our culture and our resilience. And, you know, I think the other challenge that is coming is all of the cries to cancel Canada Day. And the challenges that brings is that creates a divide, a bigger divide between the people who don't understand or don't know or are not educated or informed about what's happened or why these calls are happening. So I've been very deliberate to stay out of the debate here in Victoria, at least, to say that's not my decision. That's your day of celebration. I just don't see how fireworks or a carefully curated list of bands is going to help us at this point. But don't say it's because of me and my pain that we're canceling it. This is about somebody else's guilt. This is about somebody else's trauma. This is about somebody else's truth. Don't put it on me. With regards to reconciliation, there has been a lot of work that has been done. And I feel like I've done my fair share. I feel like I have developed a lot of relationships where I can, you know, sort of lean over to somebody and say, well, that's your stuff, or you need to pick this up and take it from now, because this is where I'm done. I think, you know, one of the things that I always talk about is Alec Nelson. He said, if you're comfortable, then you're not doing it right. It is a very uncomfortable time for us as a community, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations, but only for the next 2 or 3 generations, and then we'll be through it. You know, this idea that to have a year of reconciliation, it's unreasonable. You can't fix anything in 1 year. I won't accept just 1 year. I am committed to doing this for the rest of my days. And I've been talking to my nieces and nephews, and now having little conversations with my grandnieces and nephew, so that they understand that this is going to be hard work for 2 or 3 generations, and then we'll be through it. And then we can say we have reconciled. But it is something it is going to be challenging. You know, Lorelei talked about Chantel Moore and wellness checks. And, you know, the one thing that I've tried and sort of draw a straight line from that incident on June 4th to another incident on July 3rd. Chantel Moore was in her home, may or may not have had a knife. If she's New Charles, I'm guessing she probably wasn't very tall. They're beautiful, powerful women, but you know, they're probably smaller than the average male police officer. And on July 3rd, a man who was, I'm not sure if he was former military or military of Caucasian ancestry, crashed his truck through the gates at the Prime Minister's residence with several illegal firearms, with rifles on his body and in his vehicle, and they spent 3 hours negotiating a peaceful settlement. He crashed his truck through the gates at our Prime Minister's residence, and they spent 3 hours negotiating a military man's de-escalation, and yet Chantel Moore was shot in an instant. So you can't talk about systemic racism without drawing straight lines from where the system is broken. In plain sight, and the investigation that happened here in British Columbia and the healthcare system, it is not enough to say we won't be racist anymore. We have to spend time to rebuild the trust and the relationship from the people who have lost faith in the healthcare system. I have been in too many situations. I was doing an event a few years ago. We do something called the Back to School Picnic, where we take school supplies to different communities around the island and around the province here in BC. And we were in Port Alberni, and a volunteer, a young woman who had come, and she had gotten school supplies from us for a couple of years, and now she was in college and she just wanted to come and volunteer, but she had a new baby. And she said, I'm just waiting, my neighbor's gonna come and watch the baby. And she went to hand over the carrier, and the babysitter didn't realize that the bottom of the carrier, the cushion had slipped. So she only grabbed the top of the carrier, and the bottom of the carrier fell, and the baby fell out on the pavement of the parking lot. And everyone screamed and picked up the baby, who was silent, which is scary. And my late mother was there. She was a retired nurse, and she said, we've got to go to the hospital right away. And the young mother said, they won't do anything for her. They won't listen to me. We'll just sit there for hours and they'll tell us to go home. And my mom insisted, no, we have to go. And she said, if you're not going to take her, I'm going to take her, but I would like you to come with me. So off they rushed to the hospital. It was only a few blocks away. And sure enough, my mom, because she's a nurse, she speaks hospital room, emergency room, explained what happened, and they took her right in, and they saw her right away and took great care of her. And the woman said, I've never had that kind of treatment at the hospital before. If my mother wasn't there, if we weren't there, would she have had her baby treated? Probably not. And there are stories like that, you know, where firsthand people have said, I don't trust the healthcare system. They're not going to do anything for me because I'm Indigenous. I was working with a friendship center, so I actually have a PowerPoint, which I'm probably not going to refer to now, but I worked with BC friendship centers around BC, and one of the challenges in the north is dentists won't see status Indians because they don't want to deal with the paperwork. So if you want to go see the dentist, it's 2 or 3 hours drive to see the one dentist who will see status Indians. And that's just the way it is. They have whole programs designed around it, that all of the dentists in that northern city don't see status Indians. That's racism. It's because they have extra paperwork. You know, we talked a little bit about the education system and the curriculum, and you know, to hear people talk about the necessity. You know, we can't. And I've been talking about this a lot this year too. We can't blame people for their ignorance. They're part of this failed education system. I didn't know that. When they took down the Sir John A. Macdonald statue here in Victoria, I had to Google bad things Sir John A. Macdonald did. I wasn't taught in school. I didn't go to post-secondary, but you know, to hold people accountable when they've never been taught. They've never been told the atrocities that we've suffered as a people. They've never been told the truth about the people they erect statues to. So although I was in great favor of the statue coming down here in Victoria and never thought I would be on the side of let's find a place for it, I thought the perfect place, and I told Mayor and Council this, the perfect place for it is at the bottom of the harbor. And maybe his finger can be pointing out in the middle just so we remember he's there. But now I think there is a place for him, as long as there is some truth in it, as long as there is some information that people can understand. This was once a very powerful man who did some very bad things and made some very bad decisions, and set up some policies that are still rippling through our community today. You know, looking at things like the correction system and policing and healthcare and MCFD, even place names, you know, fighting over place names. We are having, I feel like we're having some good responses to some of the names that are the places that are being reclaimed. It's not that we're changing the name, we're going to start calling it by its actual name. Different mountains in different areas in this region, and the municipalities in the province are now open to that idea. So we're lucky in that way. I think for me to think about reconciliation and what it means, and St. Mary's, I've been to this St. Mary's in Mission, the Aboriginal, the back to school picnic that I was talking about, the elders chose the old school grounds for the picnic. And I took a deep breath, and my mom, she came on the tour with me, and I just said, "Are you going to be okay?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm going to be okay." And she said, "But maybe we should smudge, maybe we should do something, maybe we should do something." And so the elders said that they wanted to serve the food, because food was a big deal in residential schools. Starvation was sort of part of the experiment. And they wanted to be part of the abundance, and they wanted to be connecting to the children, and they wanted to put love into that food. And we did it for 3 or 4 years before Mission took it over for themselves. But those elders would come and they would ring the school bell and they would call their ancestors in to show them the survival of our people. And it was a beautiful thing. We had a similar experience here in Victoria. The second year I had been involved with the planning, there was probably 500 or 600 people, and there was just everywhere lineups going this way and that way, and kids, you know, running around having fun and getting their faces painted and jumping on bouncy castles and eating lots of food and watermelon. And I was standing up on the hill outside the Friendship Center looking at the sea of people, trying to see if there was any problems, and I could see this elder who was starting to hunch more and more over her cane, and I thought she was in medical distress. So I called for first aid and went and grabbed a chair and grabbed a tent and grabbed some volunteers, and we put the tent over her. She got her seated down in the chair. First aid brought her, started taking her vitals, and I asked the woman, she was hunched right over her cane now at this point, should I call an ambulance? And she shook her head and she tipped her head back and she let out the most mournful cry I've ever heard a human make. And she said, "I never thought I'd see this day." She said, "They came and they took me away, and I never knew my parents. And they did things to me, and Then they came in, they took my daughters, and there was nothing I could do. And she says, and now my granddaughters just went skipping down that path with their backpacks on their back, and they just want to get their faces painted and have lunch, and all they know is joy. All they feel in this moment as they get ready to go back to school is love. And she said, I never thought I would see this day. I never thought I would have this feeling. And so in that moment, in this woman's epiphany, I realized my mother was a resistor. My grandfather went, and she was there for about a week. And he went and took my mother and her two younger siblings out, and he put them in a closet in the house and sat in the kitchen with a loaded rifle, waiting for the priest and the RCMP to show up, which they did. And he fought. He said, I will shoot whoever crosses my threshold. Who would like to be the example to the other? And the priest screamed and stomped and threatened eternal damnation. And the RCMP officer, to his credit, said, let's go away. I'll come back and talk to this gentleman. And he said, I'm going to come back. And so he came back the next day and said, your kids need to be registered for school. That's all. And my grandfather, he worked for Mac Below at the time. He was able to register his kids in a private school just down the street. They went to school every day and came home every day. And that RCMP officer was the one who de-escalated the situation and didn't make it so that my grandfather had to kill somebody to protect his children. But he did have to load his rifle, and he did have to sit there and stake his claim. This is my house, these are my children, and I will decide how they're raised. And while this woman is having her epiphany in the parking lot at the Friendship Center, I realized that everything that I have achieved in my life was because of that moment of defiance. We are a resilient people, and we are working hard, and all we ask is for other people to take on their fair share of reconciliation. Help us find this balance that we are so desperate for. Realize it's not a checkbox. It's not going to happen quickly. And there's lots of ways for us to get there. You know, whether it's Adam representing his people or his constituents, maybe they're your people too, at a provincial level or other politicians at a national level, whether it's, you know, chief and council, whether it's counseling and therapy, whether it's culture, you know, this idea of people dancing and being referred to as butterflies. It just brings joy when you hear it and when you say it out loud. Culture is something that can not only help people feel something and help people understand something. Not only is it a demonstration of our resilience, but other people feel things too. And there is something about music, there is something about song, there's something about regalia, there's something about storytelling. All of the government reports and all of the journalistic reports, we can put them out there, splash headlines from coast to coast to coast, and tell people emotionally connect to these stories. They're not going to understand. They're not going to feel anything about it. You know, I think this idea of not being emotionally connected to these stories is wrong. I think there are people that are afraid to take that wall down. And I think if we can get more people to sort of feel those things, then I think it will be a great breakthrough for us as a country. There are lots of other challenges with policies and things like that. I mean, if you think about oral tradition and you think about Indigenous language, if this country had spent half as what it spent on French, on Indigenous language, I would speak my language today. I think there are about 35 people who speak my dialect now. Cowichan Tribes is the largest nation in British Columbia with 4,900 members, and I think there are 35 fluent speakers left. and the youngest is in her 60s. So what happens when those 35 people are gone? If this country spent half as much as they spent on French. So recently we received $50 million a year. That is a third of what they spend on French in the province of British Columbia. It's staggering to think about. I think for the Victoria Native Friendship Center, we've been doing this for 53 years in August. We have started out with one employee who helped people get apartments, find apartment buildings that would rent to Indians. That was a problem back in the day. And then that turned into finding people who would employ us. Finding jobs was like fish in a barrel back in the day. We just needed an introduction. Today we have 135 employees. We've got 54 contracts. You know, this idea that the government is giving us things. The proposal process to get those contracts is onerous. The contract negotiations to get those contracts is onerous. The reporting process to report out on the things that you said you were going to do and the things you negotiated is onerous. And then the audits that you have to go through afterwards to make sure that everybody did what they said they were going to do for the amount they said they were going to do it. And, you know, it is challenging as a nonprofit of this size to spend so much of my year getting money into the organization, accounting for it all, and then getting it out. I spend very little time with my staff and with my people. I spend most of my time working with governments, working with funders. It is a challenge, but a burden that I've accepted and work very hard at. I'll never forget the frustration of, so if anybody's ever been to the Victoria Native Friendship Center here, we have 3 totem poles representing each of the island nations here on Vancouver Island, and worked very hard to get those. They were tied to an employment program, and we were trying to come up with some sort of solution to get more people into the program. They were running half empty. The people who signed up, only half of them would finish. And so that would mean 2 or 3 people would have jobs at the end of it or be in post-secondary. And we decided to try something big. And so we said, if you come to training on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you can carve on the totem pole on Thursday and Friday. Suddenly the program was full. 95% of the people who started finished, and 100% of the people who finished had a full-time job or were registered into full-time post-secondary at the end. And the government was ecstatic. These were amazing statistics. So let's do it again. So we did it again. And we carved another totem pole, and 96 more people got, you know, jobs, went through this program. And then when it came time to do it a third time, our contract manager changed. And they said, we've heard great things about this program, and we've heard you've had some amazing results. It's time to start it over again. So we submitted the proposal, and she said, this looks great. We'll do everything except the totem pole, because we don't do public art. So you either have to take out the totem pole or withdraw the proposal. And we said, well, the totem pole is the reason it's successful. And we explained the whole thing, and we showed lots of pictures, and no. So we should have asked them for a no. We should have said no, respond to the proposal, but no, we withdrew it, and we found some private money, and we were able to do it. But the challenge that we face as Indigenous nonprofits is that we are always fighting with the government, who wants us to be innovative, who wants us to be creative, but gets in the way when they start to say things like that. It is a big challenge. I spent most of the day being interviewed today by people excited about a gesture of reconciliation that's happened to us. There's a woman, her name is Marian Cumming, and she has donated 2 houses to the Victoria Native Friendship Center. One is in 1.4 acres up in Cowichan Station, about 30 minutes north of us. 1.4 acres, and the other one is in Oak Bay. And it's not even the first time she's done this. She did it 30 years ago on the East Coast. Her and her husband, Bruce, donated 288 acres and their families' homes to the local nation. Long before reconciliation was even a concept or an idea, her and her husband said, when we go, the land should be given back to Indigenous people. So I have hope. I have confidence. I'll do this for another 25 years and train a bunch more people to do it behind me. I believe there are open hearts out there, and there are open minds, and we just have to find them. We just have to connect with them that way. You know, we have to share the load. We can't take it all ourselves. We have to find some peace for ourselves as well as for our people so that we can run this marathon and finish it. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ron. You know, it is just listening to your experiences and the work that you've done. Amazing work to heal and to really build a future, which would benefit everyone. We truly believe that if we can call it the original sin of Canada, right? To help to heal that challenge is what will give us the promise of the country that we all would like to live in and we all would like to see. But and I would say that what you were saying about caring hearts, I think that everyone on this event today has that across the board. I think that the majority of people, settlers in this country, do have that. And you hit it right on the head. The challenge is education first and foremost. You know, how many people know anything about John A. Macdonald? Even you know that he was the first prime minister. Like, many people have zero knowledge. And the systems that you've developed, culturally sensitive, culturally relevant, to find those solutions, it's inspiring. It's inspiring to see you taking that. And I actually, there's a Muslim prayer that I'd like to share because I thought of you when you were talking. I'll say it real quick. It's not too long. It's from the Quran, and it's Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. And every time I hear from First Nations leaders, I always remember this because it says by time, so by the existence of time, humanity is at a loss, except for those who do acts of good and who are patient. And I always remember that in these situations. So you're a man doing acts of good, and your patience and perseverance will pay off. Thank you again for your voice and for sharing with us. I'd like to, I know we're going just a little bit over our time, but our last speaker today, I'd just like to introduce her and thank her for joining. Jacqueline Hensu is the Women's Support Coordinator at the VACPC. She is responsible for connecting with and supporting families, including of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She participates in these program designs, the strategic planning, and the program proposal development, which is the whole thing, including client outreach, referrals, and supporting and maintaining partnerships with other organizations. Jacqueline, please, why don't you share about the work and the resources available for the community?
Thank you so much. Jacqueline Henus here. I am Wewikai, Namgis, and Haida on my mother's side, and I'm Nawa, which is Indigenous to El Salvador on my father's side. I'm the Women's Support Coordinator for the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center. I had a great mentor, Lorelei Williams, as you guys have all met before. I'm also a member of Butterflies in Spirit with Lorelei Williams. So part of the work that we do is we mend the gap between Aboriginal people and the police. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult, especially during times like this. And around the same time last year, I think you guys mentioned Chantal Moore, situations like that, and trying to be the third person, the middle person, kind of navigating through that. I also help women and families who have missing loved ones. We've located, so out of the 16 people that have been reported missing to our office, 3 have been located deceased. 1 is still considered missing, and the other ones we located, and with the help of Lorelei Williams, actually. Like I said, she was a great mentor to me. She taught me everything I know in this position. Some of the other things I support women with is doing police reports. We also support women with MCFD, with the school board. I've gone to meetings with women who are having difficulties. I believe, sorry, excuse me. I believe just the speaker before me, I believe it was Ron. He was mentioning some of the difficulties that Indigenous people face within the school system. That's very true. It's something I support women with MCFD as well. We have a lot of women who need that extra support. I have a background in court as well, working as a legal advocate. So I've supported women in family court and in criminal court. I'm trying to be really quick here. I apologize. I'm actually doing a delivery for a family member who has COVID. So I have the dinner in the back, so I'm trying to be quick. So I do apologize about that. But if you have any other questions or supports that you need, I have a lot of networks and resources for you. Our number is 604-678-3790. Is there anything else you want me to talk about?
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. We'll put all the contact information you mentioned into the descriptions of all the videos that we'll be uploading and sharing. And I really appreciate you coming and joining with us today to share this. I know sometimes life gets in the way, but you took your time to come and share your experience, your resources with our community as well as your community. And we thank you for that. We thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. So friends, I know we went over a little bit, but such an important topic, something that touched all our hearts, was to hear the reality of what our community, our family here, human family, is experiencing, which, as Ron said, it's hidden. It's a hidden history and a hidden current reality. And that's something that we hope to change. Again, I want to thank everyone, but before we close, I'm just going to invite my friend and colleague, Tariq Tayyab, to maybe say a few final words. He's a co-founder of Islam Unravelled and Foundation for Path Forward, as well as the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services, where we do provide a lot of support for Indigenous communities through the Muslim Care Center program on the downtown east side. Tariq, would you like to share some words, please?
All I want to say is I'm humbled to be part of this auspicious group and very grateful to be with you and to work with you in solidarity for the future. So the honor is ours, the honor is mine. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Tariq. And that concludes our event tonight, everyone. I pray for your health and well-being. I pray for your success in your dreams and aspirations. Thank you to John Horgan, Premier BC, Jagmeet Singh, who both sent in such caring messages. Thank you, Bardesh, the Honorable Bardesh Chhabra, Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, who not only took her time to speak with us today, but stayed for the entire event. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much, Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, for your words and sharing your view for the future of Canada and Canadians. Adam Olsen, always a pleasure, sir. You're a good-hearted man, and we always love to hear from you and your perspective and that of the BC Green Party as well. Kasari Govinder, BC's Independent Human Rights Commissioner, thank you for your time and sharing your voice with us today. He wasn't here with us, but he was here in spirit. I'd like to give a special thanks to Norm Leach, who's the Executive Director of VACPC, for co-organizing this event with us and all the time and energy that he put in to help bring the speakers together. I'd also like to say Jazakallah to Mufti Asim Rashid from Islam Unravelled for his wisdom and perspective. Amy Go, thank you so much for your allyship and being here today to stand in solidarity with our brothers, sisters, and friends in the Indigenous community. The Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice is one of the most amazing organizations that we've had the privilege to work with. Thank you for being here. Lorelei, words can't express how grateful and humbled I am with you sharing today. It is something that it's almost a catch-22 to have the need to hear this, but then also have to ask you to re-experience that trauma. And again, yeah, if I said anything that was triggering, I do apologize, but I really am grateful for you sharing your voice with us. And I hope that everyone can learn and grow from what she shared. So thank you so much, Lorelei Williams, and God bless you. Ron Rice, Wushk, Executive Director from the Victoria Native Friendship Center. Thank you for being here and sharing the perspective for what a better Canada could look like and the ways that we can get there together. And Jacqueline, thank you for sharing the support. We'll make sure that everyone is aware of those resources available. And to our viewers and to our supporters, thank you again for joining us on National Indigenous Peoples Day. The supporting organizations that really help our initiatives bring this together. We couldn't do it without that support, including the Canadian Ministry of Heritage, the Ministry of Diversity, Youth and Inclusion, the Province of British Columbia, Resiliency BC, and the Anti-Racism Network, VACPC. Thank you for co-organizing, as well as the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the amazing work they're doing. I'd also like to thank the Victoria Native Friendship Center as a whole for the amazing work you're doing and for taking time to join with us today. And I'd also like to finally thank a couple of our sponsors, including IDRF, for the incredible work they're doing locally and internationally in supporting humanitarian causes. Everyone, I know it's a bit of a long one, but thank you for joining. Thank you for sharing your voices. And I encourage everyone to think, to ponder on this event, to heal tonight, and then to take up a cause of action for tomorrow. Because as Ron was saying, it's generational change that we're gonna have to work on, and it's a marathon. So thank you, everyone. God bless you. Have a beautiful evening. Take care.